Wetland and aquatic animals have special adaptations to survive, whether it's a beaver's webbed feet, a duck's oily feathers, or gills on a shark. These help the animals survive in the habitat where they live. Hey everyone, today's lesson is on adaptations, mutations, and natural selections. So, organisms that are lucky enough to live long enough to reproduce get to pass on their traits to the next generations. Organisms that are best adapted to their environment are going to be the most likely to survive. So we call this evolutionary fitness. And organisms have adaptations that help them survive in their environment. And these adaptations can either be structural, behavioral, or physiological. Structural adaptations are physical adaptations on the body of the organism. And again, the organism can be a plant or an animal or bacteria or fungi or whatever. When we look at wetland animals, so animals that live in an aquatic environment, some of the adaptations that we might see are gills for organisms that live underwater like fish and tadpoles. Organisms that live in the water often have tails that are used in swimming, so we'll see this in whales and sharks and fish. Scales and mucus to help protect an organism, help it slide through the water effectively. They have the ability to adapt to water pressure using a swim bladder to either rise or fall in the water column. Mammals and birds that are aquatic often have webbed feet to help them move through the water. So we see this in ducks, sea otters, even some dogs like Newfoundlands and Labrador dogs have slightly webbed feet. Animals that often live in the water will have oily fur or feathers to help keep themselves dry, trap a little bit of air to help them stay buoyant near their skin. And they're often more streamlined and have a thick fatty layer underneath their skin to help insulate them from the cold. Some other structural adaptations include caribou feet, which are broad and flat that help them stay on top of a snowpack and helps them evade predators such as wolves, which don't have this ability. Beavers' teeth, which never stop growing, which allows them to continue to gnaw branches and trees throughout their lifespan. And the eye placement, if you're a prey animal, typically you'll have eye placement on the side of your head, which allows you for a nearly 360-degree view of your surroundings. And predator species, such as humans, typically have eyes on the front of their face. We see this also in birds of prey, which really allows us to triangulate the distance between us and our prey species so that we're effective at hunting. Behavioral adaptations are things that an animal or plant does. So some behavioral adaptations would include being nocturnal and being active at night versus being diurnal and being active during the day. Choosing to fight in the response to a threat or to run away. White-tailed deer have an adaptation that if they see a threat, they run away and they run far and then they hide. Mule deer, because they grew adapted to live in the open prairies, will run a certain distance away where they feel safe from their predators, then they assess the situation. Squirrels have distress calls, which can startle other species as well. They will bring more animals into the area to help them chase the predator away. Birds also do this, where you can play a bird distress call, and birds of all different species will swarm the area hoping to chase away a crow, a magpie, or a hawk. Squirrels also store food to last them through the winter, and we see this in other species as well. Beavers will slap their tail on the water to warn other beavers and other animals that there's a threat in the area. And these are all behaviors that animals do to help them survive. Physiological adaptations are adaptations that affect kind of the internal running of the bodies of animals or the bodies of plant species. So some would be the difference between being a cold-blooded animal or a warm-blooded animal, the ability to use different senses, whether it's an electric field sense in animals like sharks, or to see the thermal impression that animals leave, which is very useful if you're a nocturnal animal hunting at night. Marine mammals are very effective at gas exchange in their lungs. So 80% of the oxygen that they inhale will get circulated in their blood and get moved into the muscles where it's needed and the brain. So this allows them to stay underwater for longer periods of time. Dolphins are able to put half of their brain to sleep, which allows them to continue to rise in the water column, to breathe air from above the water. And then they'll put the other half of their brain to sleep at a different time before, so they get the whole brain rest. The ability to produce toxins in plants helps them keep from being preyed on by herbivores and keeps them alive long enough to reproduce. And other animals are able to change their color in response to a threat or climate. So we see like snowshoe hares will be white in the winter and brown in the summer. Adaptations are due to gradual changes in the characteristics of a population over time. So this is a change in the characteristics of a population. So remember, a population is a group of species in one location at a certain time. So it wouldn't be all the bears in the world, but it might see a change in the bears in Yellowstone National Park, for example, in the United States, or in Yukon, Canada. We might see a change, but it doesn't affect all the animals of a species. So although variations can result in adaptations, not all variations are beneficial. So if we do have an adaptation, will affect all members of a species, again, in that location at a certain time. And a variation is a difference within a species. So how, if we look at black bears, some are black, some are brown, some are golden, and some are even white. So this is a variation within a species, as opposed to an adaptation, which would be like the black bear's claws, which all the bears would have. Variations are typically the result of genetic changes. We also can call those mutations, and recombinations. And recombinations occur during sexual reproduction. So as the egg cells are formed, or as the sperm cells are formed, there's regrouping of certain traits. Sometimes there can be errors made in the copying of that genetic material, which can lead to different variations of traits that occur in the next generation. So all variation is due to mutation, whether it is in that recombination or whether it's random changes in the DNA, which can just happen during copying DNA, or it can happen during, it can be caused by things like radiation or other mutagens that an animal or plant might come in contact with. So we see these variations through mutations because all of our DNA codes for different proteins, and proteins make everything from hair to fingernails to claws to teeth to blood to muscles. And a change in the genetic code for one of those physical traits alters the sequence of amino acids that forms the protein. And as that protein changes, it changes the action that that protein makes. So we have different proteins as humans that will make our eyes brown, hazel, blue, amber, silver, golden. So all those different eye colors are coded for by different proteins, which at one point were mutations from the original eye color genetic code that we had. Some mutations occur in our somatic cells. So these are the tissues that make up our body cells, basically everything except the testes and ovaries. So these mutations are going to disappear when the organism dies. So say I had a mutation that caused me to have like a patch of white on my head hair. This I wouldn't pass on to my children because it occurred in my somatic cells or my body tissue. However, if mutations occur in the germline cells, so in animals, these are the testes or ovaries, so they produce sperm or eggs, the mutations can be passed on to the next generation. And these mutations can occur in utero of an organism. So if the deer is pregnant with a female fawn and she comes in contact with a mutagen and her embryo has a mutation in that germline, it will pass it on to future generations. Or if a fish comes in contact with a mutagen and it alters that fish's testes, any sperm that fish produces after the fact could have mutations that will be passed on to the next generation. Some mutations that are random produce a selective advantage because they allow for an organism to be more likely to survive to the next generation. So in humans, the ability to digest milk is not universal. Not all humans can digest milk, but it is beneficial because it provides us with another source of nutrients, calcium, fats, proteins, and calories. So the ability to digest milk way back when, increase the chances of a human surviving to the next generation, and then therefore passing their genes on to the next generation. So we're going to look at a few case studies now of selective advantage and in organisms, so mutations that are advantageous. So in California, there are some ground squirrels that have developed a mutation that makes them resistant to rattlesnake venom. So as you can assume, being resistant to rattlesnake venom, one of your main predators, would be a very advantageous mutation, because if you were bit by a rattlesnake, you're not going to die. So now those squirrels have a greater ability to hunt for food, don't have to spend as much time watching for predators, so they are more likely to survive and pass their traits on to the next generation. So ultimately, within several dozen generations, this trait is going to be much more common in that squirrel population because they're more likely to survive to reproduce. So in a case study where we can see benefits of an adaptation to mosquitoes, but not benefits to people, we're going to look at mosquitoes and DDT. So in 1955, the World Health Organization initiated a program to kill mosquitoes using DDT because mosquitoes carry a lot of diseases. And one of the main ones in certain areas of the world is malaria, which is a serious disease where a lot of people end up dying from it every year. So initially, this program was very successful in decreasing mosquito populations, but mosquitoes quickly reappeared. So over time, DDT became less effective at eliminating mosquito populations. And then due to the negative environmental effects of the DDT spraying program, the program was discontinued. So one of the major negative effects of the DDT program was the bioaccumulation, or the buildup in body tissues of DDT in higher order predators. So birds that ate mosquitoes that had been sprayed with DDT ended up with DDT in their body tissues. And then birds of prey, so eagles, peregrine falcons, and hawks that preyed on those songbird species, ended up with higher amounts of DDT in their body tissues. And this ended up being negative because when they went to nest on their eggs, the eggshells were so soft they ended up crushing them, and they weren't able to successfully breed. They weren't able to pass on genes to the next generation. They weren't able to have a next generation. So since the discontinuation of DDT, they've seen a rebound in the population of many birds of prey. But why did that DDT lose its effectiveness? So, if there were some individual mosquitoes that survived being sprayed with the DDT, they were able to breed, pass on their traits of surviving DDT to the next generation. And because mosquitoes have a very rapid lifespan, as well as have a lot of offspring, we would see rebounds of mosquito populations very quickly that now are resistant to DDT. So we'd have to use more, or we'd have to use other pesticides, which is why the program was discontinued predominantly. There are a few places in Africa, possibly South America, that still use DDT to control mosquito populations because they do carry so many diseases that are harmful to humans. So one case of natural selection that we are pretty familiar with from hearing in news stories and in the media is the case of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So in 1928, Sir Alexander Fleming discovered that penicillin could be used to kill bacteria. And allegedly, he discovered this because he had a very lazy housekeeper who didn't always keep his lab clean. And he discovered a moldy sandwich in one of his petri dishes that ended up pushing back the bacteria from the mold. So there was a clear area in the petri dish where no bacteria could grow. And he was able to isolate the compound in this mold that is an antibiotic. It ended up killing the bacteria, prevented the bacteria from reproducing. And so it was more than a dozen years later before penicillin was able to be used as a medicine in 1941. And this was really important in World War II because so many people were injured in the battlefield, which is dirty. They weren't able to keep the wounds clean, and lots of people ended up dying from infection. However, by 1945, so 4 years later, there was already reports of penicillin-resistant strains of bacteria. And now there are bacterial strains known to be resistant to all forms of antibiotics. And so one of them is called MRSA, and this would be methicillin-resistant Streptococcus aureus. And so it's a really tough bacteria to kill. There are types of tuberculosis, strains of tuberculosis that are resistant to all known forms of antibiotics. So people who happen to have those strains of tuberculosis end up just being on a monitoring level of antibiotics to keep their tuberculosis in check, but they still have that disease. And we're still looking for new antibiotics, but it is a very slow process. And so it's taking a lot of time for scientists to find new types of antibiotics. So when we're looking at antibiotic-resistant bacteria, so what happens is when you take the antibiotics, sometimes there are bacteria that die really quickly and other bacteria that take a longer time to die or to stop reproducing in the presence of antibiotics. So when some bacteria, when they don't die in the presence of antibiotics, they end up reproducing and then their offspring are resistant. So now you have a strain of bacteria that's resistant to that previous antibiotic. So it's important as citizens of the world to help reduce the risk of antibiotic-resistant bacteria by, one, if you're prescribed antibiotics, you take your entire dose until it's done. So usually you start feeling better after a few days, but it's important to continue to take those antibiotics until your entire course of antibiotics is complete. Also, we don't want to overuse antibiotics. The more we use antibiotics, maybe when they're not always necessary, we're exposing more bacteria to antibiotics, allowing more of them to possibly become resistant to different antibiotics. So mutation and adaptations lead into the theory of natural selection. So natural selection occurs when individuals that have beneficial adaptations are passed on to their offspring. And eventually that's going to change the whole population. So we see this in the ground squirrels that are resistant to venom. So they are more selected for by their environment. And for natural selection to occur, there must be variation within a species. So we have some ground squirrels that are resistant to venom and some ground squirrels that aren't. So in a population, individuals are selected for by their environment. So that's one thing that's important to note, is the environment exerts pressure on a species. The individuals that are more likely to survive to pass on their genes. The individuals that are less likely to survive get eaten, killed, just don't get the chance of mating, and then their genes are not passed on to the next generation. Another very important point is that individuals do not change during their lifetime. Individual plants and animals have the traits that they have. Those traits don't change during their lifetime unless they happen to come in contact with a mutagen. But the population changes over time. So we'll see shifts in the traits of a species based on the environmental pressure. So when we look at a population of grasses, some grass is better adapted to survive drought conditions. So if a drought occurs, we are going to move our entire population over to a group of grasses that are more drought resistant. So we started with this amount of variation, and then the grass on this end is not drought resistant. So these grasses tend to die, and then we're left with these grasses that are very drought resistant, and now they're going to make up the bulk of the population. So it's important, again, that natural selection does not anticipate changes in the environment. So we start with grasses that are not drought resistant to grasses that are very drought resistant and everything in between. Then a random change occurred and traits are produced that may be beneficial in the future. So we have very drought resistant plants. Then that environmental change occurred that we had a drought, and some of these variations are going to increase the chance of survival of these grasses. So now these grasses are going to make up our whole lawn or our whole prairie ecosystem. And the grasses that weren't drought resistant end up dying before they have the chance to reproduce. So some variations are not beneficial in certain environments. While they may not be harmful, they might be simply useless, right? So having curly hair, not beneficial. There's no evolutionary benefit to having curly hair. Being able to digest milk, very beneficial in certain environments. So that trait is more likely to get passed on to future generations. We can also have detrimental variations, which are unlikely to be passed on unless the environment changes to select for that specific variation. So if there was for example, on the west coast of Vancouver Island, on the west coast of BC, not Vancouver Island, there's a variation in black bears that allows some of them to be white. And these are also known as Kermode bears or spirit bears. Now, this variation would be detrimental if people still were hunting black bears in that area because it makes them really easy to see and spot out. So that would be a harmful variation or a detrimental variation if black bears were a species that were able to be hunted. Occasionally we see this in moose on the East Coast where there'll be albino moose. And again, it would be a detrimental variation because it's not easy for them to hide, so they're more likely to get preyed on by predator species. Well, thanks for sticking with us for this lesson on mutation, variation, and natural selection. I'll catch up with you guys next time. Bye.
If you enjoyed this video, check out our website, online.plrd.ab.ca, and visit us on Facebook, Prairieland Online Academy. You can find out all that's going on with Prairieland Online Academy.